and welcome back to BlockTV. Now, every Sunday, the crypto community receives a treat in the form of a well-researched and thought-through Twitter thread by one of the top writers documenting the ecosystem. I'm talking, of course, about none other than Nathaniel Whitmore and his long-read Sunday Twitter column, a bit of a New Yorker, one can argue, for the crypto block news. And as in every week, we're joined by Nathaniel, this time from the, I think, the Hudson Valley in New York, to present and discuss the highlights of this week's long read, or as I said, the New Yorker of the Sphere. Nathaniel, hello to you.
Hey, how's it going?
Lovely. I'm very much happy to start with number 5 in the list of 5. And there
I feel like
Go ahead.
I feel like this is the never-ending LRS source material, right? So this is, I guess you could call this the follow-up to last week's kind of big defend crypto campaign. I think we've actually talked about it a couple weeks in a row.
Very much, and we've been following the Kick story. You're talking about none other than the Kick story, and this time around you actually picked, and I read the whole thing through, which is amazing for a mother of two, Catherine Wu on the SEC suit against Kick. And it's her long thread of basically, let me explain her. She's a lawyer, and she went entirely legal on the SEC document, didn't she?
Yeah, she actually used to work at the SEC before coming into the crypto sphere. She worked with Masari for a while and just has a really interesting kind of broad perspective on things. And so, I think that the meta event that we're tracking here is the SEC versus Kick. And Kick, with its Defend Crypto campaign, was very clear that they wanted to kick up a stink, to use a pun, and really pin down the SEC to force them to prove that that tokens were securities, right? They believe that the tokens were not securities. They believe that it wouldn't stand up to real legal scrutiny in a court of law. And the SEC has now responded with a big lawsuit against Kick for their ICO. They've released all of their kind of the case. And so Catherine was basically going through the 49 pages of documentation that they released.
With a pen, a red marker, and a highlighting.
Exactly.
Now, the thing that's so fabulous about this, because she even goes down to, look, at the end of the day, many people have covered and stated in articles that the SEC has a very strong case. And until Catherine Wu went with her red marker through this, I didn't understand just how strong of a case they had against Kick. And she really breaks it down. It's an important note, as you mentioned, that she's somebody from within the sphere, but she's basically breaking it down, saying, the whole segment there where Kick, bosses should not have put stuff in writing, which she notes on it. She really notes. I'm wondering with you if somebody, well, first of all, what's her conclusion out of this? You take it away.
I mean, I think that the conclusion is most people feel like there is, it really comes down to kind of two different parts of the Howey test, which has been the standard for a long time for securities designation, competing with each other. One is the expectation of profit, and the other is the idea that there is a common enterprise.
Right.
And so the SEC is very strong on the expectation of profit part. They over and over and over again show different areas where Kick leadership or Kick team seem to be indicating that people can expect profits, and seem to be kind of throwing all the utility arguments, out the window, or kind of like chuckling behind the scenes, which makes them look really bad. The question, though, is that, again, this is legal. It's not just about how people look. It's what actually is the law. And there's another part of the Howey test, which is that the firm has to be kind of in a common enterprise with these investors for it to be a security. And Kick is really convinced that there's that they're not going to be able to define it as such. They have legal precedent to back it up. And so I think the frustrating thing for a lot of us who are observing is that this feels, on the one hand, like it's got significant importance for the space as a whole, but on the other hand, it feels kind of like it's going to come down to almost legal technicality that's unlikely to be particularly conclusive for other projects.
I think it's going to boil down to personality, dare I say, and by that, look, the paper that Catherine really so beautifully put out there really shows that the SEC is going backwards. They have all kinds of proof that Kick pivoted into cryptocurrency when it thought it was losing money. And I think that's one of the problems they're going to face in court. Because the SEC can bring out all this documentation, like, you're not here for the ideal of it all, but you were basically exactly saving your business, which, hey, time will tell. But fascinating Fascinating read, very well picked by you. Let's move on to number 4. Number 4 on the Long Read Sunday. There we go. Nathaniel Whitmore list. Balaji and decentralize or be nationalized. Tell me more about this.
So this is kind of, I think there's a common thread running through a lot of the stories this week. And just kind of, it's because it's what's going on more broadly speaking. And I think there's this, the regulatory questions are not right now just about, are tokens going to be considered securities? There's a larger issue of what the relationship between governments and technology companies in general and crypto companies in specific is going to be. So you see the drums beating with antitrust legislation around companies like Facebook in the US,
right.
The idea that potentially Instagram or WhatsApp would be forced to be spun out again. And I think that there's kind of a worldwide this interesting question of just what governments can do to take on these tech companies, which have grown such a huge force. And so what Balaji is pointing out is that there's kind of two very different potential outcomes. One is almost governments kind of nationalizing or at least treating them effectively like utilities and arms of the state. And on the other hand, there's the decentralized argument, or ideal, maybe, let's put it for now, where these companies become something that's different, right? So Fred Wilson also kind of wrote about this week. He wrote a piece called Open Up Instead of Breakup, or Open Up versus Breakup, where he suggested that a more effective action than trying to, quote unquote, break up a tech company like Facebook is to force it almost to become a protocol, where it has a different openness to people leveraging the data and building things on top of it. So, whether that's just highly idealistic or not, I think that obviously those of us in the crypto community who are watching it are pretty interested in some of these ideas as well. So again, for me, the Balaji's particular tweet, I think, is just emblematic of a much larger conversation of this.
And I think very well picked, because I think exactly as you mentioned, decentralization, which has now become, and you rightfully said so, an ideal. And not necessarily something that, I think this is the battle of, will it remain part of the idea itself, apropos ideal? And yes, apropos the G20 meeting at the end of the month, but also Facebook, I think, will raise all these questions once they unveil their coin and whatever it is. And rightfully so, you picked then number 3. We're going to move to number 3 because it goes straight to the heart of this discussion, and that's the India crypto trading ban paired with proposal for a digital rupee. And I think nothing exemplifies what you just described better than what India just proposed, which is on one hand, a law yet to pass of a complete ban with a draconian prison sentence if one is caught trading cryptos, unless, of course, and to that is attached the notion of a very nationalized coin. Explain more what this thread is.
Yeah, and again, this is another one that's emblematic. I think it's always important whenever you see it's a very popular headline in the crypto space to take a piece of legislation from somewhere that we don't necessarily understand what it would have to actually go through to pass.
Right.
Present it as though it's actually happening and kind of use it as some cataclysmic news. So I don't want to make it seem like that, but I do think what was so interesting about this to me was that it in a single bill expressed the yin and yang of the way that governments are thinking about crypto. They are increasingly recognizing that the implications of non-sovereign money has big implications for their sovereignty, right? And it's actually unbelievable that it's taken 10 years of this industry for this to really start to creep into their consciousness. I think in some ways we've had almost a grace period to try to build it out. But then on the other hand, they're recognizing that if they were to spin up their own digital currency, and people have different names for this, so a central bank denominated currency or whatever it is, basically a state digital dollar. You have it creates an unbelievable tool for surveillance, for control, for information, and of course, there's good arguments why this would be valuable from a protection standpoint, right? You can get the bad guys by watching where money flows. Of course, it opens up a huge amount of potential for abuse, for surveillance, and all these kind of things that tend to come with.
Apropos China, one can argue. Anyways, and I said that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so exactly. So this is, to me, it's a kind of another indicator of this ongoing battle I think that crypto is on the front lines of are these digital assets going to be used as tools of freedom, liberation, and kind of sovereignty, or are they going to be co-opted by the existing power structure and just become a better mechanism for digital surveillance?
And I'm wondering with you if all of this is becoming much more of a heated debate because of the idea or the notion, as the information brought out yesterday, that supposedly Facebook is about to launch their coin by the end of this month, which again, as I said, this is one report, one source, doesn't mean necessarily it's happening, but it seems like that debate has intensified, which brings us to number two. Number two on the long list, on the long read Sunday, Caitlin Long on Facebook, coin predictions. Caitlin Long, we all know and love, and she makes a very passionate case for the anticipated Facebook coin, which, I'm wondering with you, Nathaniel, once this thing happens, it will definitely have a humongous impact. And one can even argue that any type of regulation that will happen after Facebook launches will most likely be tailored to the Facebook coin because Facebook is so big, in that respect. But she makes a very passionate case for that coin. Detail what she does. What is her reasoning? Yeah.
Sure. So there's a couple different things going on here. So one is, again, I wanted to choose something that was kind of emblematic of a lot of news starting to seep out this week around
Facebook.
The Facebook coin. There's an announcement that it sounds like the project will at least be announced formally this month. Whether it releases or not, I think is a different thing. But we started to get information about how it's going to be governed. Apparently, there will be an external foundation. We started to get information about what it will cost to participate in the running of that. Apparently, it'll cost $10 million to host a node. And so all this information is starting to creep out. And of course, right before when we have a little bit of information, but not a lot, is the best time for speculation. And sounding smart and interesting about what you think is going to happen.
So we call rumor and supposition. Yes. Okay.
Exactly. So we saw a lot of that, and I thought Caitlin's thoughts were some of the best. So she I would say that she doesn't have a strictly positive view, but she actually errs on the side of positive more than you might think. So on the one hand, she argued that it would be positive maybe I'll focus on two of the pieces that I think are most interesting. First is that she argued that it'll be positive for the developing world. And I think her feeling there is that if you look around the world, there is, as much as we'd like there to be a flee to Bitcoin, I think in most cases, the asset that people want is US dollars, something that's just going to retain its value. And you can see that. In fact, even in places where Bitcoin is utilized, it's often to move from Bitcoin to US dollars.
To US dollar and to move it around borders. Yep.
By the way, this goes back, I think, to your point about why governments would start to care more about regulation once Facebook hits, is that a dollar equivalent stablecoin that's kind of multi-fiat denominated, it does feel like a bigger threat in some ways when you have the scale of a Facebook to a national currency than something that's completely outside the system like Bitcoin. So that's going to be really interesting to watch. So one of Caitlin's points is that net positive for the developing world. A second point that she makes, which is kind of her sixth point actually. So there's a bunch of stuff in between around interest and who participates that I think is really fascinating if you kind of want that inside baseball. But she kind of ends on this big note about what does this mean for Bitcoin? And her argument, she calls it a beneficial detour, which I think is a really interesting way to put it. And I've seen a couple people make this point that this is, Facebook's audience of billions. This is going to represent the biggest exposure to the idea of cryptocurrencies of any event in history.
There's no doubt that this is instant mass adoption. It's instant mass adoption to nearly 3 billion people, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And some portion of them, even if only a fractional portion of them, kind of this is their touch point moment. So another person, BJ, who we had on the LRS this week, wrote about Bitcoin touch points and how you get exposed and how many times you need to get exposed to kind of get into this idea of Bitcoin. This is a huge touch point. And so, you do the math, if 2 billion people, are exposed to this and, 5%, even 1% actually kind of really dig in, you're talking about an increase of the total number of, Bitcoin users and other cryptocurrency exposed folks.
True, but does she touch on also the price that comes along with it? Because there's no hiding the fact that true Bitcoin evangelists are looking at the idea of, granted, we're all in the sphere waiting for that mass adoption moment. Facebook represents a beautiful opportunity for that one, but at the end of the day, that means that decentralization would have to be given up in a certain way, because it's not going to be decentralized. Come on.
Right. I think that so this is me interpreting what I'm seeing from the people
Of
who are
course,
kind of,
and we're theorizing. Yes.
yeah. So I think that there's an interesting question around mass adoption. Actually, I think that people are the Bitcoin narrative has shifted a little bit from this is something that people need to use every day, which has always been kind of like a background narrative that surges at different times and dominates at some times,
Yep.
to this is something that's a kind of a hedge against unstable monetary regimes. It's a hedge against the quantitative easing experiment. It is a long-term kind of store of value that exists as this underlying and underpinning layer of a larger kind of decentralized finance world that potentially, I mean, depending on what your persuasion is, could include lots of other different types of things. And so I think that the prerogative to have everyone using Bitcoin all the time isn't even for kind of the hardest core Bitcoiners necessarily the main point anymore. So how Facebook fits into that, I think that there's room basically for that cohort to simultaneously be, understand that Facebook is effectively another centralized kind of coin that's really going to be to their benefit, ultimately, while also still being excited about the possibility of, call it, 10 million people like reading Jameson.
Exactly. And look, and she does, once she phrases it as a necessary, what was it, a necessary detour or a welcome detour?
Yeah,
it's a detour, though.
detour.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it is a detour from the original idea. And, the question remains, I think we're all in the midst of this process, is, what comes out at the end of it, which leads, though, and you kept it very much on the same lines, as you said, to number one. Number one on today's Long Read Sunday, and that is Jeremy Walsh on the end of AdTech versus Shift Towards. It's a fabulous long read. I got into it, which can also be described as a longer look into the pros and cons of the General Data Protection Act. I almost looked at it that way. Yet to be enacted fully in the United States. I think it's on its way, though. And it kind of summarizes this big debate. What does Welch, though, surmise at the end? What did you get out of this?
I think that the big point, hold aside all the details about GDPR or anything specific almost, what he's recognizing is that there is a shift in tone, in narrative around data and around privacy.
Right.
And we're shifting from kind of this freewheeling data is the new oil, we're really comfortable with trading our data for free services, to potentially something very different. And I think that Jeremy makes the point that this isn't coming from just one direction, right? He's not just talking about, like, you have economic actors, right? A big thing that happened this week was Apple putting privacy front and center, right? They released effectively an alternative to social sign-on, which uses a burner email address and which collects no data, and which they're forcing all third-party apps in their ecosystem to accept, which has huge implications for Google sign-on and Facebook sign-on, right? So you've got the economic factors. You obviously have, as we mentioned before, tons of regulatory war drums around antitrust, around legislation. You're seeing it already happen in Europe and other parts of the world. And then you also have this kind of like larger cultural question as people make this an issue. And so these things combined potentially shift the narrative. Now, all of that said, we're still addicted to, free internet services based on trading our data. And we don't really, I don't think, have a strong sense of what the implications of those things are. So, I'm excited to see this conversation shifting because I think it's incredibly important. And I think that there's probably a lot more common sense in between than like reimagining the world exclusively as, there's all of your data is self-contained and you don't give it away. On the one hand, to what we have now, which is just totally freewheeling and open. There's going to be middle space. It's entirely,
but what I loved about this, and I'm asking you, because at the end of the day, Welch argues back and forth. Nathaniel, agree with me. I think you have a kid. I have two. That I think children this day and age, we're concerned about privacy, and privacy by all means is a human right. But I do think that it's a different generation that regards this as an open source and they don't really care in many, many ways. And yes, the conversation is shifting, but data is what is being traded, and is privacy even something that can be regained? Is what I try to get out of this. Can it even be regained?
Yeah, well, so you made the assertion, which I agree with wholeheartedly, that privacy is
dead.
A human right. Well,
it's a human right, but I think it's dead. It's awful to say. It's a human right, But I think we've given it up. I'm sorry for turning this into a philosophical
No,
debate, but yeah.
Oh, well, the philosophy debate is the best part. No, I don't disagree with that. I think that to the extent that I'm an optimist here, I think that there's a lot more that we can almost mandate that companies do and that organizations do than now. And I don't think, I don't know, the conversations that we're having, I guess the part of me that's optimistic is that we didn't have a template for this before, right? We set out to create this. And I think so. One of my favorite pieces on this topic ever was an essay. It was a cover story in the Atlantic magazine, probably, I don't know, 7 years ago, something like that, by Ethan Zuckerman, who's at MIT Media Lab and run the Berkman Center at Harvard. And he called it the internet's original sin. And he talked about being there in the early days with these search engines and things like that, and trying to figure out what the business model was going to be. Was it going to be micropayments? It's all the same things that we talk about now. But display ads, banner ads were easy. They made sense. They were fast to implement. And that just started the whole thing. And it wasn't a bunch of guys even who particularly cared about ad tech. They just wanted to provide, economic fuel to allow internet builders to keep building things. And so we've kind of slowly gone down this hill since then. And so I guess the point that I want to make is that we didn't have, in a different way than in a lot of industries, we didn't start with kind of this like malicious idea of how things could be exploited. We've just been the frogs in the pot slowly boiling. And, the question is really, to me, is it already boiled? Are we already just dead and we don't know it yet? Or are we just at the edge where we can start to turn down the temperature and do something different? And, I have to think, and I have to be invested in solutions that think it's the latter, because if it's the former, then we might as well just give up and go home. So that's why I love threads like Jeremy's that are, not just making the point, but also he's putting his money with his mouth is where with Casa Hodl's, with Casa's data practices and how they help people, kind of custody their own assets, whether it's data or something else. So, I don't know. I think that part of the biggest reason to be in crypto, despite how intense it can feel sometimes, is this like almost irrational optimism that something else is possible. So, listen,
amen to that. But I think, you're the optimist. I'm going to play the pessimist. But after all, I am sitting in the Middle East. But that said, indeed, I think this conversation entirely is something that leads to a possibility of stirring away from toxic data. Nathaniel Whitmore of Long Read Sunday, I want to thank you very much for this very cohesive list of threads. As we said, this was Long Read Sunday for this week. Don't forget also to check it out every week on BlockTV. And we'll be right back.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.